In the year 1853, hidden deep within the rural backroads of Alabama, the Sullivan twins were born. Children so unsettling, so difficult to describe that even the doctors who glimpsed them swore they could not be explained by science. Their lives began in secrecy, hidden away inside a farmhouse with shuttered windows, their very existence erased from official records. What remained were only whispers, scraps of memory in family Bibles. Late-night tales murmured when fires burned low. This is the story of the Sullivan children. How one family concealed them. How doctors buried the truth. And how their legacy still lingers in the fragments of records that survive. If stories like this draw you in, then you're in the right place. Go ahead, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the mysteries we uncover here. And as always, let us know in the comments where are you listening from tonight. Our story begins at the very edge of a small farming community in Alabama, a place where isolation was not a choice but a way of life. In 1853, families lived scattered and far apart, bound by the rhythms of the harvest. Bound by tradition and bound most of all by fear of what could not be understood. The Sullivan farmhouse stood alone at the end of a dirt road. Its windows were boarded tight from the inside, its chimney smoke curling into the sky long after every other neighbor's lamp had been extinguished. It was a house people rarely visited, though the family itself carried a respected name. In the daylight, townsfolk spoke politely of the Sullivans. But at night, the conversation shifted. Neighbors told of faint cries drifting across the fields when the wind turned. Some swore they saw candlelight moving through the upstairs rooms well past midnight. Others claimed they heard voices, two of them, murmuring together in eerie unison. And yet, the Sullivans themselves never spoke a word of explanation. The patriarch, Thomas Sullivan, was a man of strong presence, his posture upright, his hat always in hand when he entered the church pews. His wife Eleanor was rarely seen except at his side, her gaze always lowered to the ground. For a time, their secrecy might have gone unnoticed, dismissed as the eccentricity of a private family. But then came the whispers of a birth, a difficult one, a strange one, a delivery shrouded in silence. No midwife would speak of it, though one surely had been present. And after that night, the Sullivan home grew darker still. Children in the community soon learned to keep their distance, not because their parents warned them, but because instinct told them something was wrong. Some claimed to see small figures moving behind the shuttered windows. Others said Thomas himself would chase them away, his tone sharper and harsher than it had ever been before. For a man once known for his neighborly handshakes and quiet generosity, this sudden change was unsettling. Something had shifted inside the Sullivan household. Something powerful enough to turn pride into paranoia. But it wasn't until the arrival of a traveling physician that rumor became something more. His scattered journals, what little remains of them, suggest that he had been summoned, or perhaps compelled to see what the Sullivans were hiding. What he recorded was brief, but terrifying. The twins he observed were not merely unusual. They existed beyond the boundaries of medical knowledge. Children, yes, but something more. It was this traveler who first gave the whispers shape. In 1853, the roads of the South carried constant passers-by traders, surveyors, peddlers of medicine, both real and false. Most left behind nothing more than a footprint in the dust. Yet one man, remembered only as a physician from Georgia, stayed long enough to leave his mark on the Sullivan secret. He had been following the road between Montgomery and Selma when he was directed toward the Sullivan farmhouse for supper and a bed. Hospitality was customary in those parts, but what he saw and heard that night was anything but ordinary. In the scattered notes that survived, he wrote that the Sullivan home felt uneasy. The curtains were drawn tight despite the heavy summer heat. Smoke from too many lamps thickened the air. Eleanor Sullivan spoke hardly at all, and when she did, her words seemed carefully chosen, rehearsed as though she were trying not to reveal too much. Thomas, by contrast, was cordial but tense, his eyes flicking constantly toward the staircase that led to the upper rooms. That night, the physician claimed he heard something above him. Faint voices, soft, hushed, but not indistinct. He described them as two children speaking together, and though the words were muffled, the rhythm was identical. Every syllable seemed to rise and fall in perfect unison. At first he dismissed it as some trick of the ear, but the sound persisted. It unsettled him so deeply that he confessed he could not sleep a single hour. When dawn finally came, he made an excuse to leave early. Yet, curiosity overpowered fear, and before he departed, he pressed Thomas Sullivan with a simple question. "Have you children?" The physician wrote that the answer came only after a pause far too long to be honest. Thomas finally broke his silence with a strange reply, "And the Lord has blessed us in His way." No names, no ages, not even an acknowledgement of birth. Just that one cryptic sentence enough to plant the first seeds of suspicion. When the traveler moved on, he carried the story with him. In the very next town, he shared it with an innkeeper. Within a week, a blacksmith in another county was repeating the tale of a family who refused to admit they had children. And so, the rumor spread faster than wagons could travel, heavier with each retelling. The Sullivans were no longer just a quiet family on the edge of town. They had become the center of a growing unease. And with every new voice, the whispers twisted darker, more sinister, until the line between rumor and reality blurred. Friends, pause for a moment and imagine yourself in that time. 1853, Alabama. A land still young, cut from wilderness and cotton fields, its scattered towns, separated by miles of dirt roads and endless pine woods. To live in the countryside was to live apart, both shielded and imprisoned by isolation. Neighbors might live miles away, which meant secrets could remain hidden for years. But when whispers finally began, they had nowhere to hide, for in a land of scarcity, gossip was as sustaining as bread. Life in rural Alabama was brutal. Summers pressed down with relentless heat, and winters, though short, carried a damp chill that sank into bone. Families rose with the sun working the land from dawn to dusk, survival chained to the harvest. Education was rare, medicine even rarer, and superstition. That was often the only explanation people had. A child born with an illness, a deformity, or even unusual behavior could be seen as cursed evidence of sin, divine punishment, or worse. Communities leaned on scripture to interpret what they could not understand. And when faith faltered, fear took over. The Sullivans lived right at the edge of this fragile world. Their farm produced enough to sustain them, but their seclusion drew notice. While most families depended on their community trading goods, sharing labor during planting, and harvest gathering at church socials. Thomas Sullivan grew increasingly withdrawn after the rumored birth of his twins. He rarely visited town, and when he did, he spoke stiffly, as though every word had been weighed and measured. Eleanor was seen even less. She slipped into church with her husband, kept her eyes lowered, and left quickly after the final hymn. In another place, their secrecy might have been overlooked, but in a small, isolated community, difference was never ignored. Why did the Sullivans refuse to host gatherings anymore? Why were their windows always shuttered even in sweltering heat? Why did lamps burn in their home all through the night when oil was scarce and precious? Every unanswered question fed the unease. Travelers who passed the farmhouse late at night told of hearing sounds that did not belong. Voices drifting faintly from the fields, sometimes laughter, sometimes cries. Always indistinct. Others swore they saw a strange glow as if light was bleeding out from beneath the shutters. And for a people steeped in superstition, these details were not coincidence. They were proof that the Sullivans were not merely private. Proof that they were hiding something. Something kept upstairs. In mid-19th century Alabama, medicine was less a science than a fragile balancing act, an awkward mix of scripture folk remedies and fragments of outdated European texts. Most towns had no doctor at all. Families turned instead to midwives, herbalists, or neighbors with remedies passed down by memory. Leeches' bleeding roots boiled into bitter tonics, these were the tools of healing. And when they failed, there was only prayer. In such a world, anything outside the ordinary was rarely met with calm inquiry. It was branded as a curse, a warning, a punishment from God. Children born with twisted spines, clubbed feet, or even a birthmark too large were often hidden away, concealed by families desperate to avoid shame. In towns where every eye watched every other household, to admit you had a child who was different was to invite ruin. Neighbors might refuse to trade with you. Church congregations might whisper about your sins. Entire families could find themselves quietly shunned, and so shutters stayed closed. Absences were explained away. Secrets were locked inside. Doctors offered little refuge. Many traveling physicians depended entirely on the goodwill of the communities they served. To challenge superstition was to risk not only your reputation but your livelihood. And so, when faced with something unexplainable, most doctors complied with silence. Some even encouraged it, advising families to hide the matter rather than risk scandal. A few, perhaps braver, recorded their findings in private journals, knowing they might never be read, fearing colleagues would dismiss them as frauds or fantasists. This was the world into which the Sullivan twins were born. If they were unusual, malformed, conjoined, or afflicted with conditions their neighbors could not comprehend, it is no wonder their parents chose silence over exposure. For Thomas Sullivan, a man known for his rigid faith and proud bearing, children who defied explanation could only mean one thing: a test from God. Or worse, condemnation. Eleanor, bound by the expectations of obedience and silence, bore that burden in quiet desperation. And so, superstition rushed in where medicine could not. Each muffled sound from the Sullivan farmhouse became evidence of sin. Each shuttered window became a mark of guilt. In a place where science was too fragile to withstand the weight of fear, the truth was easier to bury. Before the whispers, the Sullivan name had been one of quiet respect. Afterward, it became a shadow. Thomas Sullivan was never counted among Alabama's wealthy planters. He owned no vast estate, commanded no army of enslaved workers. But what he had, he managed with diligence. His cotton and corn harvests were steady, his land kept in good order. Every Sunday without fail he appeared at church, plainly dressed, but neat, his Bible held firmly in hand. Neighbors knew him as a stern but upright man. He did not drink, he did not gamble, and he was not given to anger. His character in the eyes of the community was that of a steady, reliable Christian. Eleanor Sullivan, remembered by some as gentle, had once been seen nursing the sick in her household, caring for neighbors' children during fevers, and offering food to strangers who came to their door. Her silence, which would later cast suspicion on her, had once been interpreted as modesty. Together, the Sullivans embodied the values their small corner of Alabama prized most: faith, industry, and devotion to family. But after the birth of the twins, everything changed. Invitations to church suppers were politely declined. Their open-door hospitality ended. The farmhouse, once a place where neighbors could find help or rest, grew cold and unwelcoming. Thomas shortened his trips to town, his conversations clipped and formal. Eleanor seemed to disappear almost entirely, and when she was seen it was fleeting, always at her husband's side, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground as though afraid of recognition. It was not secrecy alone that drew attention, it was the sharp contrast. A family once steady and dependable had suddenly turned inward, and in small communities, people notice when rhythms are broken. At first, neighbors speculated. Illness, perhaps, or debt. Some whispered about private shame. But as the weeks turned into months, those explanations rang hollow. Why were there no sounds of children at play, drifting from the Sullivan home? Why did no infants appear in the church pews when families almost always presented their young with pride? The silence around the Sullivans grew louder with each unanswered question. Respect turned to unease, admiration to suspicion. In a community where reputation was currency, secrecy was a debt no one could forgive. And so, in time, certainty hardened. The Sullivans were hiding something. No one could agree on how the twins came into the world, but every version of the story carried unease. Some insisted there had been no midwife at all, that Eleanor labored in silence behind closed doors, while Thomas barred the entry to anyone who might help. Others swore a midwife had been summoned from miles away, but that she was never seen again in the community, paid to vanish, taking her knowledge with her. The truth, if it was ever known, dissolved into rumor. Older women in the parish whispered of a wagon rattling up the Sullivan Road on a stormy night, its wheels drowned by thunder. They claimed the wagon belonged not to a neighbor, but to a traveling healer. If this was true, then perhaps the Sullivans had known beforehand that this birth would demand secrecy. Yet others denied the wagon entirely. To them the story was simpler, darker. The birth had taken place in total isolation, under cover of darkness, with no witnesses but Thomas and Eleanor. The very first cries of the twins, they said, had been smothered by the farmhouse walls before they could ever touch the air outside. But there was one detail repeated in every version that never changed. The twins were said to have been born alive, and their cries, though faint, unsettled all who heard them. One neighbor later admitted that she had passed near the farmhouse at dawn and heard not one, but two voices crying together in a strange cadence. Their wails rose and fell in unison, almost as if layered upon each other. The sound so disturbed her that she quickened her pace and never spoke of it until many years later, when the story had already taken root. The secrecy surrounding the birth became evidence in itself. Why was there no baptism? In a community where infants were typically blessed and presented to the congregation within weeks, the absence of the twins was deafening. Even more suspicious was the lack of burial records. If the children had died, as Thomas curtly suggested to one neighbor, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes," then where were their graves? The churchyard bore no markers. The Sullivan property showed no sign of freshly turned earth. So the questions multiplied. Were the twins malformed, grotesque beyond description? Were they sickly, too frail to survive? Or were they something altogether different, something their parents dared not let the world see? Whatever the truth, the night of their birth changed the Sullivan home forever. Its walls no longer held a dwelling, but a mystery. Its windows shuttered not only against the weather, but against the eyes of the community. After that night, the twins seemed to vanish into silence, as though the house itself had swallowed them whole. In a place where new life was normally shared with joy, their absence became a haunting presence. Eleanor appeared in church with empty arms, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped tightly, as though clutching something unseen. When asked about her children, she gave no reply, or worse, a silence that spoke louder than any words. Thomas, once known to linger in conversation after services, now cut his replies short. He avoided neighbors' eyes. He turned away visitors at his door, even old family friends. And in a time when hospitality was not just custom but survival, such refusals struck deep. Those who lived closest to the Sullivans began to notice other details. Curtains in the upper windows never shifted, even during the suffocating heat of summer. Lamps burned long into the night, their glow seeping through cracks in the shutters. On still evenings, strange sounds drifted across the fields, murmurs that might have been children, though their tone was uncanny, their rhythm unnatural. A few swore they heard laughter, but not the laughter of children, something hollow, unsettling, echoing like voices carried back from a chamber of stone. The Sullivans gave no explanations. When asked directly, Thomas would only repeat, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes," a phrase so vague it answered nothing. Eleanor, pale and quiet, retreated further into herself until she seemed more ghost than woman, present in body but absent in spirit. And so suspicion hardened into certainty. The neighbors filled in the silence with their own truths. Some believed the twins had died and been hidden in unmarked graves. Others insisted the children lived, but bore deformities so shocking their parents could not bear to show them. And still others whispered of something darker, that what the Sullivans concealed was not a sickness of the body, but a curse in flesh. A punishment visited upon the family for sins no one dared to name. If you're still with me, tell me this. What do you think were the Sullivan twins simply hidden because of frailty or deformity? Or was there something far stranger their parents could not allow to see the light of day? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love reading what you think. And if stories like this keep you curious, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery we bring to light. The deeper the Sullivans sank into silence, the louder the world outside their walls grew. By the second year after the twins' birth, the farmhouse had become a landmark of unease. A place people pointed to in half-choked warnings passed along the dirt road. Neighbors walking past at night began to tell of light leaking through the shutters. Some called it little more than lamp glow. Others swore it was wrong, a flicker that pulsed strangely, not like flame, but like breath. A handful even claimed the light was colored a pale blue or green that stained the grass for a moment before vanishing, as if ashamed to be seen. The sounds were worse. Children coming home from chores at dusk spoke in whispers of voices floating from the Sullivan property. Not the bright scattered noise of play, not the plaintive cry of a newborn, something else entirely low. Murmurs sometimes in perfect unison, sometimes broken into sharp, dissonant bursts like pieces of a conversation that never found its way to meaning. On still nights when the cicadas fell silent and the wind died to a hush, those voices traveled farther. One farmer swore he'd heard two voices singing together, no tune in it, only a droning repetition that settled into his bones and companioned him long after he'd hurried on. Even animals behaved as though the land itself had been altered. Horses refused to pass the Sullivan gate, stamping and shying as though feeling an invisible hand. Dogs, creatures of routine and scent, barked furiously at the fence and would not be coaxed forward. Rumors soon hardened into theory. The thing hidden in the house had begun to bleed outward. Soured the soil, tainted the field. In church pews, people leaned close during sermon to trade the newest details. Some clung to the modest explanation that the twins were malformed and the parents only sheltered them from ridicule. Others whispered of something darker, something spiritual, as if the children bore an affliction, not of flesh, but of soul. A few muttered of bargains, struck with forces that were by every pious standard unholy. Through it all, Thomas remained unbowed and Eleanor smaller than a shadow. The shutters stayed nailed, lamps burned late, and the strange sounds continued to spill into the night. Each new sighting, each fresh recounting of an odd voice in the dark became another pebble thrown into a spreading pool of dread. Whatever lived inside that house, the community became certain was not meant for human eyes. In a region where trained physicians were rare and traveling doctors walked the old roads for coin and purpose, these itinerant men often blurred the line between science and spectacle. Many were charlatans peddling opium as cure-all or selling colored water as miracle tonic. Yet among them moved a few truly educated in the city's men who tried to stitch together medicine from folklore and textbooks. It was one such man, unnamed now, by time, whose visit would add a new thread to the story. Fragments of his notes survive in a county archive, a feverish scrawl that tells of a dim house, shutters nailed, shut air heavy with lamp oil and stale wood. He recorded an odd hush intervened by faint noises from above. At first he supposed whooping cough an ordinary rural malady. But the sounds did not fit. They were rhythmic and deliberate, more speech than cough. When he pressed Thomas, the farmer grew agitated, insisting no children lived in the house, that his family had suffered loss and sought privacy to grieve. Yet later that evening, the doctor claimed to have seen movement at the head of the stairs, two small figures standing close in shadow, outlines indistinct. He wrote of the eerie sensation that they watched him, not as two separate gazes, but as one, a duality that moved in unison. What he scrawled next grew fragmentary mentions of anomalies that defied the eye details he refused to commit fully to paper. Whether he feared ridicule or feared the consequences of naming it, he left it unsaid. He departed at dawn and never returned. But the few words he had shared in private with a man at the tavern were enough to seed another round of rumor. The surviving glimpses of the twins are few but chilling. The physician's careful hesitations have been read two ways. Some say he was politely masking deformity. Others insist his pause signaled something more profound, something that sat outside the categories physicians used. Neighbors who swore they overheard the children described voices that unnerved when one spoke. The other echoed, not as mimicry, but perfectly in time, the pair rising and falling together as if rehearsed. A farmer's wife recalled standing just beyond the fence at dusk and hearing the twins laugh. She fled because the laughter contained no variation. Two identical tones layered into one. It sounded less like the spontaneous joy of children and more like a single sound reflected back. Movement to unnerved onlookers. A boy who climbed an oak near the Sullivan window told of seeing two small figures step forward and back together, moving in perfect synchrony, as if one shadow guided them both. He was punished for telling the tale as a child sent to bed for falsehood. Yet, the image stuck, and he repeated it years later when the story resurfaced among grown men. If this little stretch gives you chills, tell me what feels worse to you. The idea of children crippled by deformity and hidden out of shame, or two beings whose voices and motions are so perfectly doubled that something else seems to be at work. Drop your thought in the comments. I read every one. And if you'd like the next chapter deeper into the farmhouse, into the neighbor's testimony, and into the scattered pages of that physician's notebook, subscribe so you don't miss the next unburied secret. There were physical details too, though here the truth is hardest to pin down. Some swore the twins were joined at the torso, fused so closely that no surgeon could ever hope to divide them. Others whispered of a single body crowned with two heads, or of one child bent upon the other, like a reversed mirror image. A few went further still, saying their eyes never looked apart, always locked in the same direction, as though their very sight were shared. None of these descriptions can be proven, yet all of them point toward one unshakable truth. Whatever the twins looked like, they were disturbing enough that their parents chose secrecy over acceptance. And here lies a strange silence. The medical journals of the 19th century, so eager to catalogue deformity, so unafraid of displaying suffering as curiosity, hold no mention of the Sullivan twins. It is as if they were erased, deliberately omitted, before their story could even be studied. And into that vacuum of fact rushed rumor. In absence of record, the children became less flesh and blood and more specters. Their legend haunted the memory of a single Alabama family until the very idea of them became something uncanny. When the talk turned to their appearance, even sober voices stumbled into the language of the supernatural. Conjoined children were not unheard of in that era, but they were rare enough to be paraded as divine wonders or abominations. You may recall Chung and Eng Bunker, the famous Siamese twins who toured America as living curiosities only decades earlier. Fascination and revulsion both mingled around them. Yet even their case, public as it was, could not match the contradictions of the Sullivan twins. The whispers from Alabama never aligned with any known case. Some said they were joined chest to chest, others hip to hip. Some claimed they shared organs, limbs, even a single mind. Each telling stretched the story further. One account claimed the children moved as though they were one body with two faces. Another swore that years passed, but they never seemed to age, their forms locked as if time itself refused them. And still others ventured into the realm of the miraculous or the profane. They said the twins spoke words in languages they could not have learned, or foretold events in the community before they came to pass. Wild exaggerations, almost certainly. But the more extraordinary the rumor, the faster it spread. Farmers who had never seen the twins swore they knew their shape. Women who had never set foot inside the farmhouse described their cries as though they had heard them with their own ears. Fact blurred into invention, and invention hardened into memory. And here is something I'd like to ask you. What do you think is more frightening? The idea of two frail children malformed and hidden from shame, or two beings who did not obey the laws of flesh at all? Science, of course, could have offered clarity, but in rural Alabama of 1853, science was fragile. Physicians who examined such children risked not only ridicule, but accusations of meddling with God's design. Easier, then, to leave the matter unspoken. And so, where there should have been diagnosis, there was silence. Where there should have been record, there was erasure. And in that silence, the twins ceased to be children at all. They became symbols of what could not or would not be explained. If Thomas Sullivan built the wall around their secret, then Elelanena lived inside it. Those who remembered her before the twins spoke of a gentle woman, quick to smile, soft-spoken, but present. Afterward she withered into shadow. When she did appear, her face was pale, her eyes downcast, her body thin from sleepless nights. Words were scarce from her lips, clipped and cautious, as though she feared a slip of the tongue might betray everything. Neighbors swore they saw her at odd hours, carrying trays of food upstairs, always alone. Sometimes she would part the curtain just enough to glance into the yard, her face lit faintly by lamplight, before vanishing again. Others claimed they heard her sing soft lullabies, though the words could never be made out. A mother's voice, perhaps, but stretched into something lonelier, more desperate. When spoken to in town, she gave almost nothing. A neighbor once asked her directly if she had been blessed with children. After a pause, Elelanena murmured, "Only, they are with me." Then she turned away. Not a denial, not a confession, but a phrase that hung heavy with implication. As months turned into years, she faded from community life entirely. At church, she sat wordless, her hands clenched white around her prayer book, her gaze fixed not on preacher or cross, but somewhere inward. Some whispered she was wasting away under the strain of a secret too terrible to bear. Others speculated madness had consumed her. But all agreed Elelanena Sullivan became less woman than ghost, haunting her own home. If she bore the burden within the walls, Thomas carried it into the world. Once a pillar of uprightness, he grew stiff and hard. His voice, once steady, became strained as though each word was a weight. His handshake, once firm, was replaced by curt nods. And when he turned to scripture, he no longer emphasized patience or mercy, but wrath. His chosen passages spoke of punishment of the unclean, cast out of trials sent by God to break men. Some believed he sought absolution. Others whispered he had turned defiant, challenging heaven itself to justify the burden laid upon him. And here, friends, is where we pause. Because the story of the twins is not simply about what they were, but what they did to those who tried to carry them. The father who grew harsher, the mother who grew hollow. Tell me, if you were in Elelanina's place, would you hide your children from the world or reveal them, no matter the cost? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has held you so far, I invite you to subscribe. There are many more shadows in history waiting to be uncovered, and together we'll walk deeper into them. The secrecy, however, began to wear him down. Neighbors remembered how Thomas's temper would flare in ways it never had before. Sudden outbursts when someone asked about his family, fists clenched tight when gossip reached his ears. One storekeeper even recalled the day Thomas slammed coins onto the counter so violently that they scattered across the floor, all because the man had gently asked after Elelanina's health. To some, this fury was proof of guilt. To others, it was the slow collapse of a man trapped between duty, shame, and faith. In the end, Thomas became a figure that people feared, but also pitied. His silence no longer carried the dignity of restraint. It was the silence of a man cornered by circumstances too great to name. Where faith should have given him comfort, it instead left him with gnawing questions. And where confession might have eased his shame, secrecy only deepened the shadows that surrounded his home. By the 3rd year after the twins' birth, the Sullivan household was no longer just the subject of curiosity, it had become a furnace of speculation. In a small town, where little happened beyond the endless cycles of planting and harvest, rumors were fuel, and they spread like wildfire. Every glance, every sound, every absence was stretched into proof that something unnatural lived behind those shuttered windows. Women at the well passed the story back and forth in fragments. One swore she had heard cries piercing the night. Another insisted she saw Elelanina carrying bundles too large to be food trays. Children repeated what they had overheard from their parents, twisting the details until the twins became monsters in their imagination. A boy whispered they had claws. A girl insisted they had faces on both sides of their heads. By the time these tales circled back to the adults, exaggerations had taken root, impossible to separate from memory. The gossip soon took on a moral weight. Some claimed the twins were a punishment for hidden sins, perhaps for Thomas's pride or for Elelanina's silence. Others connected their misfortune to old whispers of debts owed, of dealings with questionable folk long forgotten. In a community bound tightly by scripture, these stories found eager listeners. Proof wasn't necessary when the Bible itself provided a ready language of curses and divine wrath. But under all that superstition was another kind of fear, one colder, quieter, and perhaps more dangerous. The suspicion that the Sullivans were harboring something not only unnatural but also threatening to the community itself. Illness was often misunderstood in those days. A strange deformity could be mistaken for contagion. Others worried that the children's cries and behaviors hinted at madness, a madness that could spread or even erupt into violence. The Sullivan farmhouse, once just another home on the edge of town, had become something else, not just a place of mystery, but a potential danger. And still no one dared confront them directly. Thomas's temper, Elelanina's ghost-like reclusion, the unsettling silence of the house, it was enough to keep neighbors away. So the community did what it always does when faced with the unknowable. They whispered. They speculated. They told stories, building them layer upon layer until the legend of the Sullivan twins grew larger than the family itself. Among the fragments of their story, one of the most haunting is the suggestion that a physician, brave, curious, or perhaps reckless, did try to formally examine the twins. His name has been lost, though some connect him to Montgomery, where early medical societies were gathering notes and journals into the beginnings of organized record. What is remembered, though always in half-light, is that he visited the Sullivan farmhouse under circumstances that remain unclear. Some believe Thomas himself called for him, desperate for answers. Others insist the doctor came uninvited, driven by rumors and determination to see for himself. Whatever the truth the encounter left behind, notes brief, clinical but deeply unsettling. The surviving fragments speak of a doubling of form that resists separation, and of speech delivered in chorus with no pause or hesitation between one voice and the other. He described their eyes, how they seemed to move together, always in unison, as though tied by an invisible thread. For all their spareness, these words reveal more than any other source we have. Yet, even in his professional tone, the doctor admitted uncertainty. He confessed that he could not classify what he had seen, for it seemed to reach beyond deformity and into behaviors most unnatural. If he ever tried to publish his findings, no trace remains. Local doctors later denied knowing anything about such a case. Yet, the fragments of those notes, their handwriting rushed and uneasy, suggest otherwise. They hint that at least once the twins were seen, not just through shutters and gossip, but by trained eyes and recorded as fact rather than myth. And then there is one final line, the most chilling of all, scrawled hurriedly in the margins. They watched me. Perhaps it was only the stare of two frightened children, or perhaps it was something far stranger, the uncanny effect of voices and movements too perfectly mirrored. Whatever it was, it rattled him enough to document, yet not enough to preserve the record. For in the end, the notes did not last, and with their disappearance, the twins slipped once more into silence and legend. The notes disappeared almost as quickly as they surfaced. Some believed they were deliberately destroyed. Others whispered that the doctor himself burned them out of fear. What remains today is no more than a faint shadow of a record, a chilling reminder that the Sullivan twins nearly entered history in ink before being swallowed once again by silence. And perhaps, dear listener, that silence is more unsettling than the children themselves. For if the fragments that survive can be trusted, they were once part of something larger, an entire series of pages attempting to describe the Sullivan children in cold, clinical detail. But by the time these notes were ever mentioned publicly, decades after the events, most of them had already vanished. All that remained were scattered references tucked inside county archives, copied into ledgers by anonymous clerks. These men had no context, no explanation, and perhaps no desire to record more than the briefest hint of what they had seen. A line here, a phrase there. Enough to intrigue, but never enough to explain. So what happened? to the original account. One theory claims that Thomas Sullivan himself demanded its destruction. If a physician had dared to set his observations onto paper, Thomas, already proud, fearful, and deeply protective, would have seen it as a direct threat to his family's reputation. A man who kept shutters locked against neighbors would not hesitate to silence a doctor with coin or with threat. Others believed the truth was less direct. In the 19th century, physicians were painfully aware of how fragile their reputations were. To publish something too strange, too sensational, risked mockery or worse, ruin. If the Sullivan twins could not be neatly categorized, if their condition defied the limits of accepted medical science, then to present them at a conference in Montgomery or New Orleans might have been professional suicide. Better perhaps to burn the pages than to endure ridicule. But there is also a darker possibility. What if the notes were not suppressed by Thomas or even by the doctor, but by the authorities who stood above them both? In mid-19th century Alabama, the church held immense power. A physician's report describing children who spoke in unison, whose eyes moved as though tied by an invisible thread, could easily be labeled blasphemy. Such words threatened not just medical credibility, but religious order. If news of those pages reached the wrong ears, their destruction might not only have been requested, it might have been commanded in the name of preserving morality. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Where there might have been a clear description of the Sullivan twins, what they looked like, how they lived, how they spoke, there is instead only a void. The children slipped through the cracks of history, records reduced to fragments, whispers, and erasures. And strangely, this very act of suppression confirmed the community's fears that the truth was too terrible to bear in the light of day. When the physician's words fell silent, suspicion turned inevitably toward the church. In that time, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the law. It was morality. It was power. And if the Sullivan secret ever slipped beyond their walls, it almost certainly reached the ears of the clergy. And what then? Compassion or condemnation? Whispers suggest the latter. Parishioners muttered verses from Leviticus, warnings about the unclean, the cursed. Some said Thomas himself confided in the pastor, begging him to see the twins as a divine test. But if he sought mercy, what he received was fire. At least one account describes sermons delivered in the years after their birth, sermons thick with wrath condemning those who harbored wickedness within their homes. The Sullivan name was never spoken, but everyone in those pews knew exactly who was meant. The congregation too played its role. In small rural parishes, conformity was survival, and any family that strayed too far became a cautionary tale. For Elena, the shame of being a mother whispered about in such terms must have been unbearable. For Thomas, whose pride was already cracking, the weight of suspicion pressed heavier with every sideways glance from the pulpit. Some even claimed the church acted directly, that elders themselves crept to the Sullivan farmhouse under cover of night, desperate to see the twins with their own eyes. What they found, if they found anything at all, was never recorded. But speculation never needed proof. Some whispered that the elders advised the family to hide the twins forever, to treat them as a private penance. Others swore that muttered prayers of exorcism echoed through those walls, as though the children's condition was not of flesh but of spirit. Whether true or not, these whispers reshaped the story. It was no longer just about a family hiding in shame. It became a tale of a curse, a secret so dark the church itself moved to keep it buried. And perhaps, my friend, the strangest chapter comes next. The story of the locked room. No one agrees exactly when it happened, but nearly every version places it in the mid-1850s at the height of suspicion. One account tells of a hired hand brought in to help with harvest. Thomas warned him never to enter the house. But temptation is a powerful thing. And so one day, while Thomas worked the fields, the man slipped inside through the back door. What he found kept him silent for years. A staircase leading upward, ending in a heavy door, bolted from the outside. Its wood was scarred, deep scratches far too high to have been made by animals. Behind it, he swore, came the faint sound of children, voices, low rising and falling together like a prayer. Other versions tell a different story, of neighbors who entered not out of curiosity but necessity. A storm had torn part of the farmhouse roof, and several men from the parish came to help secure it. While searching for boards, one man noticed an upstairs chamber. Its door was locked tight, and just as they drew near, Thomas appeared. Rage unlike anything they had ever seen. He drove them out of the house before they could ask a single question. But one man later swore that in those few seconds, he saw something. A curtain shifting. A hand, thin, pale, curling around the edge of the fabric in the room beyond. The most unsettling testimony emerged not immediately, but decades later, handed down by a woman who said her own grandfather once forced his way into the Sullivan home during a bitter dispute over land. What he described never left him. According to her, he spoke of a cramped room, its shutters nailed, shut, the bed pressed against the wall, the air suffocating with the smoke of oil lamps until his throat closed. And in the center of that dim, airless chamber, two figures stood together. He would never say more, only that when he entered, both turned their heads toward him at the same instant, as if tied by some invisible cord. He ran, the granddaughter said softly, and he never spoke of it again. Whether these details were true or twisted into folklore, they became inseparable from the legend. From that moment on, the Sullivan house was no longer simply secretive, it became a prison. A place where children lived in shadows, sealed away from the world by the very family who should have protected them. But it was not just the locked room itself. People remembered it was the sound that sometimes slipped out from it. Neighbors swore that if you lingered too close to the Sullivan farmhouse after nightfall, you might hear voices. Not the playful chatter of siblings, but words spoken in eerie unison, syllable for syllable, as though one mind moved two tongues. A farmer passing the road at dusk once described it as unnatural harmony, something less like conversation and more like chanting. And when the twins did speak separately, the effect was even worse. Their voices were said to be indistinguishable, like one voice thrown across two mouths. A young girl whispered years later. Others claimed they didn't only speak together but laughed, cried, and even sang in unbroken rhythm. A man delivering grain to the Sullivans insisted he paused near the barn and heard two high, delicate voices carrying a wordless melody, rising and falling again and again, like a drone, like bees buzzing, but made of human throats. He left, shaken, convinced the children inside somehow knew he was listening. Such details, whether true or exaggerated, only deepened the conviction that the Sullivan twins were not merely deformed, they were unnatural. And in a rural community, where even ordinary twins could inspire suspicion, this perfect unison seemed to confirm the darkest fears. Some whispered of possession. Others said it was proof that one soul had been unnaturally stretched across two fragile bodies. And still more, dared to wonder if the children were human at all, or something else born of forces no one would speak aloud. Their voices carried on the heavy Alabama air, turned the family's secret into something greater. The twins were no longer hidden children. They were omens, and if their voices stirred dread, the whispered stories of their appearance left scars even deeper. No two accounts agreed, yet all were haunted by the same undertone of horror. One farm boy who swore he saw them through the nailed shutters said they were joined at the shoulder. Two small bodies leaning against one another as though balance itself required their bond. A woman, decades later, told her grandchildren they were fused at the chest, one torso, branching into two heads that turned in eerie precision. Others whispered of twisted limbs, double joints, bodies folded so strangely it was impossible to know where one child ended and the other began. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of their eyes. A traveling merchant claimed he glimpsed them by accident when a curtain shifted. He told of eyes that moved in perfect synchronicity, never separate, never independent. If one looked left, so did the other. If one gazed upward, its sibling followed in the same breath. He admitted the sight drove him away in panic, though some suspected he embellished the tale for coin. And yet, even his words rang uncomfortably close to what others had hinted in hushed tones. To neighbors already steeped in suspicion, such descriptions hardened into truth. The twins were no longer innocent children, but something cursed, something shaped by forces beyond the natural. And in an age where science had no language for deformity, difference itself was seen as sin. Harsher rumors grew in the shadows. That the twins' skin bore strange marks, patches shaped like symbols, bruises that never faded. That sometimes their lips moved soundlessly, speaking words no one could hear. The truth is unknowable. But these whispers ensured that the Sullivan twins were never remembered as children. They became warnings. Flesh and bone phantoms carried on rumor long after their lives had ended. And in a community bound tightly to faith, such whispers could not last unchallenged. For in those days, strange births and uncanny behaviors were never viewed through medicine. They were seen through the lens of the church. And if the twins were not children, but proof of sin or worse of possession, then silence would not be the answer. There would be confrontation. One whispered account tells of a night when a group of church elders gathered under the cloak of darkness. They claimed to have heard the voices themselves and could bear it no longer. Armed not with medicine, but with scripture candles and holy water, they entered the Sullivan farm. Ellen Sullivan, it is said, begged them to leave her voice breaking as she tried to shield her children. But once suspicion had hardened into faith, mercy rarely followed. Thomas Sullivan, caught between pride and despair, finally relented. He led the church elders into the secret room. And from there, the story took a different turn, not of healing, but of exorcism. It is said that the elders stood around the two children chanting prayers of deliverance, while the chanting of the Bible was heard. But the little lips spoke in unison, echoing or reflecting the same prayers. The two childish voices in perfect unison seemed to defy the gods. Some swear that the children became hysterical, their bodies thrashing violently. Others claim that they stood still motionless with only their empty eyes fixed on some invisible point. Whatever the truth, the result was the same when dawn broke. The elders left in silence, a silence more terrifying than any confession. Other stories are gentler, telling of the pastor himself visiting the family without violence, without a litany of teachings. He simply advised them to treat the children as a test of faith, to hide them, to live in shame as an atonement. There was no ceremony, no confrontation, just a command to erase the children's existence through silence. Which story is true, no one may know. But for the community, the truth no longer matters. What matters is belief. And from the moment the church was attached, the Sullivan story became more than a family secret. It became a story of sin and holiness, of what should be confessed and what should be buried forever. The most chilling thing is not just the rumors and the fiery sermons, but the silence of the medical community. If a doctor had indeed examined the twins, why are there no records left? Why did the medical records, the local medical journals, or the hospital records not contain a single mention of them? The absence was no accident. It was a deliberate omission. It was whispered that at least 2 doctors had seen them. One was a wandering physician who left a few scattered notes. The other was a young doctor from Montgomery who had been summoned to Sullivan's home. He had reportedly written letters describing the strange condition to a colleague in Mobile, but the letters had never appeared. Some said they had been destroyed by his family. Others said his colleague had hidden them, because to publish a case so unusual would have destroyed his reputation instantly. In those days, honor was everything. A case beyond the pale of science could make a doctor a laughingstock overnight. And there was another reason the church. What doctor would dare write that the pastor's advice was just superstition? Who would risk their careers to confront the clergy? No, it was best to remain silent, and that silence created a deadly void. Had doctors ever written about the twins in medical terms, they would have been remembered as a rare but natural anomaly. Instead, the silence left a black hole filled with imagination, fear, and rumor. The children were no longer human, but symbols of the devil, of the forbidden. Perhaps most haunting of all was their disappearance from the records. There were no death certificates, no baptismal certificates, no administrative records. This did not prove that they had never existed. It proved that someone had decided that at best, they were not remembered. By the late 1850s, the Sullivan rumors had died down. Not because the question had been answered, but because the children seemed to have disappeared. Passers-by no longer heard whispers in the night, nor saw the shadow of a figure moving behind the tightly closed door. The lamp still burned late into the night, but silence hung over the house. Some believed the twins had died quietly buried in the same secrecy as they had lived. Others swore they were buried in the dirt behind the house. Neighbors said they saw Thomas digging in the dark, the oil lamp flickering, while Ellen knelt in the grass whispering prayers. no gravestone, no trace. But farmers who tilled the land later said their horses always avoided certain patches of ground as if something was restless beneath them. Another story is even darker. A carriage appeared on a stormy night. The driver was unknown. Neighbors heard the wheels grinding on the wet ground, mixed with the sound of muffled crying. By morning, the carriage was gone and the house was quieter than ever. If this was true, had the children been taken away, not to be buried, but to be studied, secretly snatched from history by the same medical hands that had been silent for so long? And there was a whispered theory so fragile, it was hard to put into words, that the children had never died, never left, but remained locked in that attic room until time had erased its traces. It was said that the scratches on the door were still visible even after the Sullivans had disappeared. Some swore that years later, when the house was abandoned, there had been faint sounds from upstairs. Children's sounds. Sounds in harmony. The sounds of two voices perfectly in tune. In the end, the Sullivan story ends not with truth, but with a void. Not with an explanation, but with silence. And after the rumors about the twins gradually disappeared, the Sullivan family itself began to fall apart. If you also shudder when hearing this, don't forget to leave a comment to let me know, do you believe the Sullivan twins really existed, or are they just a product of collective fear? And if you want to continue to accompany the mysterious stories hidden in the darkness of history, click subscribe to the Sleepy History Tales channel. That way you won't miss any legends, whether forgotten by history or intentionally buried. The Sullivan family, once a name spoken with quiet respect in their small community, slowly became little more than shadows on the edge of memory. Their presence was felt but dimly, as though time itself wished to forget them. Their name, once a marker of kinship, began to be invoked more as a warning, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. Thomas Sullivan, who had once stood tall and proud in the church pews, grew restless and gaunt. His temper, already sharpened by years of secrecy, hardened into bitterness. Neighbors whispered of seeing him at night, lantern in hand, pacing the edges of his fields as though warding off some invisible threat. By day, he bent himself to the land with furious energy, but the soil no longer answered. Crops wilted, weeds rose, unchecked signs that the order of the household had collapsed under the weight of something unspeakable. Elelanena, his wife, seemed to fade into near invisibility. She no longer walked to church beside him, leaving Thomas to sit alone under the steeple's shadow. Some claimed she could be seen only in glimpses pale at the upper windows of the farmhouse, standing behind the curtains, watching the road, yet never stepping onto it. Her silence became legend in itself. To those who remembered her, she seemed not merely grief-stricken, but burdened by a secret so heavy, it pressed the very life out of her. After the disappearance or supposed death of the twins, the family's isolation deepened beyond repair. No children were ever presented, no heirs acknowledged. Relatives avoided the farm altogether, unsettled by the thickening air of dread around the Sullivan name. Visitors who offered help, labor, or even trade were driven away by Thomas's suspicion. The ties that once bound them to the county frayed until they snapped. By the early 1860s, while war swept through the South, the Sullivans had already become phantoms among the living. Records show Thomas briefly enlisted with the local militia, but his service ended almost as soon as it began. cut short by illness or perhaps desertion. L.L. Anena's name, meanwhile, never appeared again in the parish books, and the farmhouse itself, once a place of whispered unease, began to sag into ruin. Shutters leaned, paint peeled, and the once tended fields turned to barren stretches of tangled weed. When neighbors spoke of them in later years, it was never of their harvests, their piety, or even their labor. They were remembered only for what they tried and failed to hide. Their decline was not sudden, but slow, steady, like a candle that burns until all that remains is smoke. And when the family name finally slipped into silence, one mystery endured the twins. In the 19th century, when families vanished, their traces often lingered only in Bible's ledgers and half-erased notes. The Sullivans were no different. Though no county archive ever listed the twins, faint shadows of their existence appeared in whispers and fragments. A penciled line scratched into a family register, cryptic entries wedged between births and deaths, gaps in lineage where names should have been. One story tells of a descendant who swore he had seen the Sullivan Bible decades later at an estate auction. In its fragile pages beside Thomas and L.L. Anena's names, there was a line so violently scratched out that the paper itself was torn through. No dates, no names, only the ghost of something that had been deliberately erased. Other fragments surfaced, too quiet but damning. A ledger at a general store in 1853 listed Thomas's purchases, extra blankets, an unusual stock of lamp oil sacks of flour, far beyond what two people could need. The storekeeper himself added a note in the margin strange. Ordinary details, but enough to suggest mouths hidden from sight, lives denied in public, but sustained in secret. And the rumors, of course, refused to die. Children who once whispered of the Sullivan twins grew into adults who passed the tale on to their own children, who in turn passed it again. Over time, the story twisted and grew, each telling, adding something new. Some swore the family Bible held not just erased lines, but verses underlined with heavy, desperate ink passages about curses, about sins carried forward across generations. Others claimed L.L. Anena herself had filled the margins with shaky prayers for forgiveness, written in a hand trembling with grief. No proof of these things survives, but their persistence tells its own truth that the twins, though absent from law and scripture, lived on in memory. Their story endured not in courthouse records, but in kitchen whispers, in smudged ink, and in the unease of neighbors who could never quite forget. And now, dear listener, the question comes to you. What do you believe? Were the twins truly hidden, their lives scraped from the page, but not from the world? Or were they only ever shadows conjured from grief and rumor? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all, and together we keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you'd like to continue exploring mysteries like this, tales of families, secrets, and shadows that linger across generations, please subscribe to the channel and ring the little bell so you don't miss the next journey into history's darker corners. Because here in Sleepy History Tales, the past is never truly gone. It only waits to be remembered.